afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at Bethesda Jewish Congregation. My name is Amy Cortez. I'm the program director here, and it is my pleasure and honor today to have retired U.S. Navy Captain Mark Vandroff speak to us about his experience on the American team of the historic Abraham Accords. Mark served as the Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Defense Policy on the National Security Council staff at the White House. In this role, he served as the President's Senior White House Advisor on a broad array of matters including defense capabilities, irregular and non-traditional warfare, strategic weapons, international security cooperation, emerging defense technology, and space security. Before his civilian career, Mark served in the U.S. Navy, retiring from active duty with the rank of captain. His command level tours included service as the Major Program Manager for Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and Commanding Officer of Naval Surface Warfare Center, Carter-Rock, Maryland. He is currently Chief Executive Officer of Fincantieri Marinette Marine in Marinette, Wisconsin. I am thrilled that Mark was able to be here this weekend. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end, so I will ask that you hold your questions until then. Without further ado, Mark Vandroff.
Thank you. I'm going to just do a quick, everyone here can hear me? And I'll check and just make sure that you can hear me because I'm wearing a lapel mic. I always hate to contradict Amy, but I will say I am happy to take questions at the end, but I'm also happy to take questions during the course of the talk. If you feel absolutely compelled to ask a question, feel free to just raise your hand, catch my attention, and we can take questions as we go. You can ask those questions either at the end. I'm going to talk about the Abraham Accords, what led to the Abraham Accords, a little bit about what I think the lessons and the legacy as it is evolving of the Abraham Accords. But if you want to ask me anything else about the Middle East or anything else that you think you want to ask me, that's fine. I reserve the right not to answer. And when I don't answer questions, it's usually for one of two reasons. One is, and it's usually not that I lack a strong opinion about something. If I don't answer a question, one, it's because I don't know anything about what you've asked me, and I like to only talk about things I actually know something about. Or two, in some cases, there's things that I just can't talk about, for reasons of, I'm just not at liberty for one reason or another to talk about it. So without further ado, the Abraham Accords, if I could have my next slide. So I think most people would say, regardless of what anyone's individual opinion of the 4 years of the Trump administration was, the shining achievement of its foreign policy of those 4 years was the Abraham Accords. I would argue that there were many other foreign policy successes that went underreported. The agreements between Serbia and Kosovo being one that I think will bear significant fruit for the stability of Central Europe for a long time, but never seemed to get a lot of press. Some of the stuff that we did vis-a-vis withdrawing from the Open Skies Treaty, which I think will enhance U.S. security going forward and has enhanced U.S. security going forward. But none of those really made the press that the Abraham Accords did. But the Abraham Accords started with the normalization agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Pretty quickly after that, the Bahrainis joined. After that, the Sudanese came in and signed the accords. And then the Moroccans did not explicitly sign the accords. They had diplomatic relations with Israel previously. They had broken them off, and then they reestablished in December of 2020 within the framework of what was going on with the Abraham Accords, although not explicitly tied to that. But they're certainly considered an Abraham Accords country now, or at least those of us who worked on the deal consider them an Abraham Accords country. I'm going to talk about some of the unsung officials who were vital to the Accords. Obviously, besides the president on the American team, my boss in the White House, Ambassador Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor, Jared Kushner, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. They were very much the public face within Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu in the Middle East, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed. They were the principals, and they got the most ink. I'll talk about some of the folks behind the scene who were truly vital. I would never describe myself as vital to the Abraham Accords. I was lucky to be in the right place at the right time. Had any other official been in my job at the White House other than me, they could have easily done what I did. But there were a few people who were in place. Anyone who wants to, you want to see the hand of God in history, if you're inclined to look that way, there were some people that I'll go through who just happened to be in the right place at the right time, and I'm convinced we would have never gotten the breakthrough had we not just had some really good luck. And I'll go through that, so please. So the Abraham Accords, first thing I want to kind of talk about is the Abraham Accords didn't happen in a vacuum. It wasn't like one day we all got on a call and decided, hey, let's normalize relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. It took a lot of things to lead up to that. For one, Israel had had a quiet, off-the-books relationship with a lot of Gulf countries in the decade leading up to the Accords. There were a lot of folks, a lot of great NGOs and a lot of great American Jewish groups like AJC that were doing cultural exchanges, and they were going into the Gulf and they were meeting with people. So ground had been being plowed for many years. So it wasn't an overnight thing. From my perspective, President Trump's visit early in his presidency to Riyadh and Jerusalem was extremely significant, not just for what he said, but for what he did. Previous trips by U.S. officials in the Middle East had never done a direct, I'm going from Saudi Arabia straight to Israel. You always had to do a stop in Jordan or a stop in Egypt, or you couldn't say that, tell the Saudis, bye, I'm leaving and I'm headed to Israel now. That just wasn't done. Right, wrong, or indifferent, one of the things that President Trump was excellent at was doing things that had never been done before, right? And so when they went wheels up in Riyadh, he just said, fly this plane to Tel Aviv, right? I'm not stopping in Jordan, I'm not just fly it to Tel Aviv, right? And that was a game changer because it really changed some minds and perceptions in the region that we were going to be operating differently. Something that has gotten, can't talk about all, well, I can talk about a lot of this. I'll talk about what's been in the press. August 2017, U.S. rescue mission in Yemen. So the Yemeni civil war, which in 2017, the United Arab Emirates had entered as a de facto hostile on the side of the Yemeni government and against the Houthis. And they were supporting that, not just indirectly at the time with arms and intelligence, but they were supporting it directly with their own special forces. One of their H-60s went down during a combat mission. That H-60 was being flown by the son-in-law of the current president and at the time Crown Prince of the UAE. Right? So married to what Sheikh Mohammed at the time described as his favorite daughter. I make no comments about what the family dynamic must be about, but there was. And we went in and got him. And we were lucky that we had an amphibious readiness group, so a large deck amphibious ships like a little aircraft carrier. I know I have some Navy folks here that will appreciate that, and I will try not to talk in jargon. But we sent off Navy ships, a team of Marines, went in, got the crew, got them back, got them on board the ships. Both the young prince and the rest of his air crew, all were extensively injured. They were all treated medically on board the Navy ship. All of them survived, and we made friends that day. So you can look at it as, oh, why does the U.S. get involved in these foreign wars? And there's a certain, and we can talk about, I'll take questions about Yemen afterwards. That's really the subject of my talk. A lot of divergence of opinion about what our opinion about the Yemeni civil war should be vis-a-vis the government there, the Houthis, but the fact that we went and got that air crew would pay dividends down the road, right? We made friends that day. Again, our withdrawal from the JCPOA, again, a topic of some controversy, to put it lightly, but it created trust in the region amongst the Arab powers. It created trust that we were going to be there with them in their struggle with Iran, who they view as an expansionist power and a threat to the Sunni Gulf state Arabs. The various, the president's plan of the century, the Secretary of State's ministerial, all of this was designed to build partnerships and trust. And if you kind of look at what came out of that, and this was on both sides, right? Things like moving the embassy to Jerusalem, things like recognizing the Israeli claim to the Golan Heights, withdrawing from the JCPOA. On both sides, we were building trust, we were building rapport, we were getting, we were building up capital. So when it came time to ask both Israel and the Emirates to take some risks, we had a reserve of goodwill, and they had a reason to trust us that we would be with them as they took those risks. Slide. So what was I doing there, right? That's a real good question. Because I'm not a diplomat, and I'm just a dumb shipbuilder, right? That's what I've done my whole life. I just build ships. And I retired from the Navy in 2019, and I went to work in the defense industry, which a lot of people when they leave the military do. And I was sitting at my desk one day. Actually, I wasn't even at my desk. I was home. I was actually in the parking lot of the Safeway up in Potomac. I just finished grocery shopping when my phone rings, and it was Air Force One. And I got this hold for Ambassador O'Brien. And it's like, hey, Mark, I'm calling you from Air Force One. Now, Ambassador O'Brien and I have been friends for many, many years. So, close friend, he knew me. He had been our ambassador to, I believe, Namibia in the Bush administration. And then in the Trump administration at the time, he was the hostage ambassador. So he was the special ambassador who would go and try and work to get hostages, U.S. hostages, people wrongfully held, out of the countries where they were wrongfully held. And I can tell you that's a tough job. That really weighed on him, because that's a very delicate balance, right? It's like, what concessions are you going to give to a bad actor? And there's always the, if you give a concession, you're going to create the temptation, the incentive for more bad conduct. And yet there's a living, breathing human being, American, who is being held somewhere, and how do you get him or her back? So that was a tough job. He did that for the first 3 years of the Trump administration. And then when President Trump fired John Bolton, the president asked Ambassador O'Brien to be his national security advisor. And a couple months later, I'm probably not breaking news to say that Ambassador O'Brien and Secretary of Defense Mark Esper had a rocky relationship. If you follow the news, that's not making any news there. So, and I'll take no position on the cause of that, but I was the beneficiary of that rocky relationship. The gentleman who's a great guy and became a friend of mine, Earl Matthews, who had my job in the White House, was a member of the senior executive service from the Department of the Army who was on loan for 2 years to the White House. And the MOU between DOD and White House is that DOD officials would only be on loan to the White House for up to 2 years, no extensions. And everyone loved Earl, So when his 2 years was up, they asked Secretary Esper if he would make an exception and let Earl do the job for another year. Secretary Esper said no. That created a vacancy that O'Brien then hired me to fill, the defense policy director at the National Security. So the fact that Mark Esper had a rocky relationship with the White House worked out to my personal advantage, because I got to work in the White House for a year because of that. Otherwise, Earl would be giving you this talk right now, and he would be telling you about the Abraham Accords. So anyway, next slide. So again, what did I do in the White House, just to kind of give you a background? So the National Security Advisor has a staff, which is usually referred to as the National Security Council, but that's not right. The National Security Council is made up of the President, the Vice President, and a group of cabinet secretaries, State, Defense, Attorney General. They're enshrined by law to be the decision-making body for the United States on matters of national security. The National Security Advisor has a staff, and it's our job to staff and assist that body. So I served on the National Security Council staff. I was what was called a senior director, which meant I had a group of directors reporting to me, and I handled defense policy. And if you want to know what defense policy is, it's all of those things that are up there. So it's a kind of a wide mix of things that the White House had to worry about. Everything from if the president wanted to nominate a flag or general officer for another star and they needed Senate confirmation, I ran the package. Once it came from the Pentagon to the White House, it was my job to get it through White House staffing and get it over to the Senate, and then to explain to senators why this particular, if some of them said, why the hell should this particular general or admiral get another star, I got to write up the response and sometimes talk to the nice senator of, well, Senator, here's why we would really like for you to give this, to vote yes on this person's nomination. Nuclear weapons policy, space security, which took up a lot of time since we were forming Space Force. It had just stood up, and the policy under which they would operate. Because I had a background in defense acquisition, I kind of became the National Security Council's de facto liaison to the Office of Management and Budget. So when we were talking about what we thought the budget for DoD would be, I was kind of the point of contact for that on the side. Presidential travel coverage, for reasons that should be obvious. Whenever the president travels, he has to be covered by a senior member of the National Security Council staff, because you have the really bad day and the aide has to whip out the football with the nuclear codes. There's probably someone who's there to help the president with, what's going on in the world. So the president had a travel team. In the Trump administration, there were 6 of us that, had all of the briefings, the read-ins, stayed current. And then whenever the president would travel, one of the 6 of us would cover him. And so I was in that rotation. And then at the top, high-profile foreign military sales cases. Those foreign military sales cases for which the White House was interested in, it was my job to be the point for that interest. And that's where we bring into the next slide. So what was going on in June of 2020? I get a call. This was not unusual, but I am sitting in my office over in the Eisenhower building. And for those that maybe are or not familiar with the White House complex, you have the White House itself. The center part top is the president's residence. The president's offices and the offices of his most senior staff is in the West Wing. You have other offices in the East Wing. And then across a parking lot that goes by the name of West Executive Avenue, but it's not an avenue, it's a parking lot. On the other side of that parking lot is the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. That's where the rest of the president's staff is if you're not senior enough to work in the West Wing. So I was in my office in the Eisenhower building one day in 2020 when my phone rings, and it was Ambassador O'Brien's aide, and she said, "Mark, I need you over here in the West Wing. Ambassador O'Brien wants to see you," which was not an unusual occurrence. That was happened several times a week. So down the elevator, across the West Exec parking lot, into the West Wing, up to the little area there where you have the Oval Office, the Vice President's office, the Chief of Staff's office, and the National Security Advisor's office, into the National Security Advisor office. And who was sitting there but Jared Kushner, who I had not met before, but I knew who he was, and Avi Berkowitz, who I had seen before but had never met. And they were about to become key parts of my life. Because what I was told at that point was, and I did not know this, is that Jared and Avi had been going through the Middle East, and they thought that the UAE was ready to normalize relations with Israel. But the UAE was worried about Iran's reaction. And they were looking for some security guarantees. They were looking for accelerating certain systems that we had agreed to supply to them, but were going to need them faster. They were looking for additional security cooperation, which is the term of art we use when we sell another country weapons, right? We call that security. By the way, Russia and China engage in weapons proliferation, and that's bad. We do security cooperation with our partners, and that's good. Just so everyone understands. And I say that was actually interesting because at the State Department, the same office that works to try and keep other countries from selling weapons to, around the world, goes to the UN, files legal challenges, right? That group is also the one that has to approve when our DOD wants to sell weapons to our friends. And I said, we got to get that out because they have a mindset that selling weapons is bad. And I was actually arguing with them at one point. It's like, it's bad when they do it. It's good when I do it, right? When I do it, it's wonderful. We are enhancing security, right? The other guy, it's not good, right? So I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but that's true. So now Jared and Avi, and let's go, are both two men who I came to admire very greatly, but they did not have a career in government. They didn't certainly have a career in the Department of Defense. They really didn't know anything about how security cooperation works within DOD. No one in that room really did, but that's why they called me there, because it's like, I actually do know how they do security cooperation in DOD. Let me help you with that. So we started into that, and apparently the powers that be took a liking to me, because from that point on, I was part of the team that did the negotiations with the UAE, not just on the military stuff, but on the entire agreement. So, but that's how I got a seat at the table. Slide. So let me talk about some of the unsung heroes of the Abraham Accords, people that were just absolutely, I would say, irreplaceable. And that is not a good picture. It looks better. Maybe it's the screen. It looks better on the screen here. It doesn't look great on the screen up there for the contrast. So on the far left is Avi Berkowitz. And Avi is obviously short for Avraham, and we joke that the Abraham Accords are actually secretly named after him. Avi was one of Jared's, staffer to Jared. An interesting story. When we went to Jerusalem, the night that we were in Jerusalem to solidify the Abraham Accords, after we had finished meeting with the Prime Minister and his staff, we were actually out to dinner, and I ended up seated next to Jared, and I asked Jared how how did Avi come to work for him, and it was interesting. Avi had just graduated from, I believe, NYU, and he was off to Harvard Law School over the summer, and he was at a YMHA there in New York at a pickup basketball game, and they needed a fifth for basketball, Jared's team, and Avi was in the gym. And from that, Avi spent his summers, when he was in Harvard Law, his summers interning with Jared's construction company. And then when President Trump was elected, Jared brought Avi with him into the White House. So you would not, he looks, well, he doesn't look very much, it's hard to tell in that picture. Avi looks younger than he is, and he's not that old a guy. I mean, at the time, this was a 31-year-old guy who probably looked like he was 19. But he graduated at the top of his class at Harvard Law School. And he brings not only a fiery intellect, but a real spine of steel, coupled with a tremendous amount of humility for someone that's that successful at that age. He has virtually no ego. And he had the ability to just interact with all of these. Usually he was working at the ambassadorial level. So he would talk to Dermer, he would talk to, I'll talk about Youssef, Ambassador Al-Taibi here in a minute, but he would interact with them and things that didn't go up to the head of state. And for a young guy without a lot of experience, he was amazing. So I hope he continues. Right now he's back in the private sector, but I hope someone picks up and he continues a career of public service. Next to them is General Miguel Carrera, who is now retired Major General of the United States Army. He was, if I had to see the hand of God in this, it was having Miguel where he was at the time. So General Carrera was in Korea, getting ready to come back. He had been, at the U.S. Forces Korea, getting ready to come back to the States. Rob Greenway, who was my counterpart, he was the senior director for Middle Eastern Affairs. So, and Rob was a retired Army Green Beret, retired Colonel, Army Green Beret. Great guy. I should have had him up on this page too. And he and Miguel had been Green Berets together. They were buddies from the Army. So we called up the Pentagon and said, hey, instead of giving this guy some staff job on the Army Chief of Staff, some two-star, Pentagon job, wherever his next rotation was, please loan him to us for a year or 2 years. We'd like him on the National Security Council. And General Milley, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said no. And we said, we're the White House. You can't tell us no. And he said, I'm the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Yeah, I can tell you guys no. So then Ambassador O'Brien and eventually President Trump convinced him that no, you actually couldn't tell us no. And we got Miguel cut orders. And that's why Miguel is retired as a two-star, not a three-star, because the Army, I don't think, was real happy with him after we pulled those strings. But thank God that we did. Literally, thank God that we did. And now I'm going to tell you why. Before Miguel was over in Korea, he was our defense attaché in Abu Dhabi for the UAE. Remember I talked about when the Sheikh's son or son-in-law was rescued in Yemen? The guy who was on the phone coordinating that, talking Sheikh Mohammed through that as all of that was going on, that was General Carrera. The two ended up getting to like each other. So for the rest of his tour as attaché, he would go out in the desert and falcon hunt and ride camels with, at the time, the Crown Prince, now head of the country. There were a couple of times when it was looking like we weren't going to get there on a deal, and between the bureaucrats on our side and the bureaucrats within the Emirati side, Miguel just flipped out his phone, called up the Sheikh. It's like, what will you take for an answer? What will you not take for an answer? And they had the friendship and the trust and the connection to get there. The other interesting thing is now another bond between, I'm from Central Florida and still have an abiding love for the University of Florida. General Carrera is a University of Florida grad, another reason why I like him. But he's a Puerto Rican American whose family was in the oil and gas industry, worked for Exxon and for Mobil. And growing up, he did a fair amount of time overseas in international schools in the Gulf area, which meant that he was fluent in Arabic. It also meant that he knew the Deputy Defense Minister of Kuwait because they had gone to high school together, and he knew the Deputy Defense Minister of Saudi Arabia because they had gone to high school together in one of those schools. And again, the contacts, once we were working through this, you just couldn't, you couldn't have recreated those personal contacts. So General Carrera's presence almost, because when we asked for him from the Army, we had no idea this was going on. We just knew that Rob Greenway wanted his buddy with him over in the White House, and we thought he'd be useful because he had been in Abu Dhabi. He understood the Gulf region really well, right? We didn't realize that we were going to get a history-making international agreement out of that, and really out of the fact of the contacts he had. In the center, Rabbi Ari Lightstone. Rabbi Lightstone was Ambassador Friedman's special assistant at our embassy over in Israel. Again, talk about The 4 years he spent in Israel, creating trust, building relationships, as much as Miguel was our secret sauce with the Emiratis, Lightstone was our secret sauce with the Israelis, right? He had really, during his time he had lived in Israel. He's an American, he's a New Yorker, but he's been back and forth a lot. The Israelis knew him, the Israelis trusted him. He had a rapport. He was key. Two Emiratis at the end there, and really the visionary, the most effective, and I believe this, the most effective ambassador from a foreign country currently in Washington, D.C. is Ambassador Al-Attaibi, Yusuf Al-Attaibi, the ambassador from the United Arab Emirates. He could give a class in what a good ambassador should be. He loves the United States. He was educated here. He went to Georgetown for college. So he understands and gets us, but he is 100% Abu Dhabi's guy. And if he tells you the Emirates are going to do something, it's because he's had a conversation with the head of state, and that he will say, if he says, yep, we'll do this, you know that they will do this. If he won't make a commitment to you, right, it means he hasn't talked to that head of state and he's not getting out ahead of his boss. Right. And he has the trust and confidence of his boss, and the boss has trust and confidence in him. And that's what you want in an ambassador anywhere, right? The ambassador knows what the head of state thinks back then. They're representing some place that they like, that they're not there hostily. I mean, and he really likes America. He really understands us, but he's not our guy. He's Abu Dhabi's guy. And so he's representing Abu Dhabi's interest here. Ambassadors around the world could take a lesson from Ambassador Al-Attaibi. And then my main counterpart in talking about security cooperation, that's General Rashid bin Mohammed. Now he's the chief of staff of their Air Force. At the time, he was the vice chief of staff of their Air Force in the Emirati. An F-16 pilot with very much a fighter pilot's attitude. I joked that he was the kind of guy who wouldn't take yes for an answer sometimes. But he was a patriot for his country and was really interested in making sure that the Emirates had the security guarantees they needed in order to move forward with the agreement. So there's the day, and you'll notice, that's on the left side, that's President Trump talking to Prime Minister Netanyahu and Sheikh Mohammed on the day that we got the big agreement. After that, talking to the media, my one chance to say a couple of words. I almost wanted to look at the president and say, nice tie, because if you notice, President Trump and I are wearing the exact same purple tie that day. And that is now always after that, I refer to that as my Abraham Accords tie. I will wear it now on special occasions. I had no idea I didn't even realize the president owned that tie. And it was unusual for him to wear a purple tie. But it's one of my favorites. The other thing you will notice that all of the male officials there, so you have Jared, Secretary of the Treasury Mnuchin, my boss, Ambassador O'Brien, Rob Greenway, the former Green Beret, who was my counterpart, who brought Miguel over on staff. He and Miguel had served together in the Green Berets. You'll notice that we are all wearing white shirts and dark blue suits and then monochrome ties, because that's what you wore in the Trump White House, right? He had a real look for what he wanted people to wear, and so that was the uniform of the day. So for my year in the White House there. But yeah, I didn't say nice tie, but if you look, I almost looked at him and said nice tie. So it was quite the day. The other thing is, this was obviously at the height of COVID. That made it logistically more challenging. Also, my wife and my daughter wanted to get the heck out of Washington, D.C. So at the beginning of July, I drove them down to Florida, where my sister has a beach house. And my sister wasn't using her beach house that summer. And she said, it's empty. If you want to get away from everything and just shelter in place down there, you could. So I drove down, drove back, and then every night I would call my wife and check during the month of July, we were traveling around. We were trying to make this happen. And, luckily, for better or for worse, didn't have my family there with me. They were away. So I had plenty of time. But when I would talk to my wife, she would say, "So what did you do today?" I said, "Well, just trying to achieve world peace," and she thought I was joking. And then it was right after this, she came back. She's on the side. It's like, "I told you we were trying to achieve world peace," right? So anyway, so after this, that's a ticket or boarding pass from the very first flight from Tel Aviv to Abu Dhabi, direct on El Al. And that's my boarding pass for that. And you can see General Carrera and Jared and I, and me and Rob, some pictures there. If you ever get a chance to go to the Emirates, if you ever have a chance to go. It's an amazing country on a lot of levels. You got a picture there of the Sheikh Zayed Grand Mosque, and there's the El Al flight there in Abu Dhabi on the runway there after we landed. I will tell a story. Go forward one, and then let's see if it's, go back. So another little story. I guess this is, once I say it, it's going to be public because you're recording this on YouTube. But I think I can get away with saying this. So Miguel had called, and made the final arrangement for that El Al flight not to have to fly around Saudi airspace, but to fly. Remember I told you he knew the deputy defense minister in Saudi Arabia from his high school days and got us permission to overfly Saudi Arabia. And now that's a thing. Flights to and from Dubai and to and from Abu Dhabi don't have to go around Saudi Arabia. They can go over on their way to Tel Aviv. So we're in the air and we cross into Saudi space, and the pilot comes on and says, "Hey, look out! We're out of Jordan. We're in Saudi space. We're on our airspace. We're on our way to Abu Dhabi, and we're on this El Al flight, and we're looking out." And you had up in the front end, you had the senior American staff, and then with it, you had the senior Israeli government officials. And the senior Israeli government official on that flight was Meir Ben Shabbat, who was Prime Minister Netanyahu's national security advisor. And Mr. Shabbat looks out and he sees the Star of David on the El Al wing over Saudi, as we're looking at the map and we're over Saudi airspace, and he starts to tear up. And my boss, Ambassador O'Brien, has an irreverent sense of humor. So he saw him doing this, and he leaned over across the aisle and put his hand on him and says, "Come on, this isn't the first time an Israeli plane's been in Saudi airspace." and Mr. Shabbat looked at him, and without missing a beat, looks at him and says, "It's the first time we've been invited." So what did I learn from that? I left very much an optimist. Peace is possible, and I believe that. Peace is possible. It is not an unsolvable problem. The Abraham Accords were fundamentally an exercise in changing the incentives. Incentives matter, and we changed the incentives. We managed to provide for Arab countries an incentive in closer relations with Israel. Part of that was provided by the threat of Iran, but we managed to provide incentives on them having a close relationship. We incentivized the Israelis to not engage in premature annexation of the disputed territories on the West Bank. With the right incentives, that changed the behavior. I'm willing to discuss this in the Q&A, but my current concern is right now we're in a situation where the incentives are not working towards peace. They're actually working away from peace. But with the right incentives, it's possible. Anything is possible if no one gets credit is also true. At many times, there were many times where people who were involved in this could have. So let me ask this: was everyone here remembers turning on the news that day? I assume, or many of you, right? Were you all surprised? Did that surprise you? You hadn't heard anything in the news. This is happening. This might be happening, right? Again, if you send someone on a secret mission, it's helpful to keep it secret. So if no one cares who's going to get the credit, no one's trying to get their own name in the paper, you can get great things done. And leaks did not secure it. Israel and QME. So who here, is anyone here familiar with the concept of qualitative military edge? So just real briefly, there's a policy that has been enshrined in U.S. law that says the U.S. has to maintain a qualitative military edge for Israel's forces, which gets interpreted that we sell Israel our very best stuff, and then our partners in the region get something that isn't quite as good as our very best stuff. So that Israel stuff, whatever you want to call it, missiles, fighter jets, tanks, has got to be better than the countries around it, so that they have a qualitative military edge. Back in the 1990s, when that law was passed, that was an excellent idea. Today, I'm worried for a variety of reasons that it makes Israel less safe, not more safe. And it makes the region less stable, not more stable. And I can talk more about that. And that needs to be looked at for reform because it's having a counterintuitive effect right now. And then my final one, a trip to Jerusalem is always wonderful, but with a stopover in Abu Dhabi, it is even better. So that was my involvement in the Abraham Accords. Kind of a personal view. I am happy to talk about the Accords. I'm happy to talk about what they're doing in the Q&A. I just got back from Morocco, spent 10 days there in December. I got to see the Accords in action. I was in a synagogue in Marrakesh, and I saw Israeli tourists who are now flying direct Tel Aviv to Casablanca and Marrakesh because of the Accords. I saw Israeli investment in hotels in Morocco. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Moroccan Jews who had fled to Israel in the 40s they're now back in that country where they had deep roots to, and they're investing and they're making people's lives better. Ultimately, that's what's going to bring peace, is when people start asking, that man or woman on the street in Haifa, that Palestinian Arab on the street of Nablus, the Moroccan walking the street of Fez, the Sudanese farmer outside of Khartoum. If we do things that make their lives better, that's where peace is going to come from. And with that, thank you for having me here, and I'm happy to take your questions. Yes, sir.
The obvious question. Can you elaborate on your second bullet point under peace is possible? Because that's the crux of where we are with the Abraham Accords today.
Right. So here's my concern, right? Let's say, I'll take both sides. So let's say you are part of I'll take three sides. I'll start with the Palestinian Authority. Right now, if you're the leadership of the Palestinian Authority, you receive billions of dollars a year of aid from the European Union and from various Arab governments and from the United States when you all total it up. To which that leadership skims off a non-trivial amount that goes to their Swiss bank accounts. The minute they become an independent, functioning government that has to engage in taxation and maintaining a stable currency, that all goes away, because if you're your own government with your own currency, your own stability, it becomes harder for the government leaders to siphon off big chunks of cash, because you can have corruption. I'm not being Pollyannish here, but if you do that with your own independent currency, your currency is going to tank, right? The currency markets aren't going to stand for that. So if you are a bigwig at the Palestinian Authority, changing the status quo to statehood looks like you're going to be costing yourself money. If you're Hamas, one, you're kind of ideologically committed to the destruction of the state of Israel. But even if you weren't, your paymasters over in Tehran are, and again, a peace treaty isn't going to be good for your bottom line. Let's take the Israel example. Let's say you are a Israeli maximalist. I'll call it. You're an Israeli who has a maximalist view of the territorial integrity of Israel. If you get a peace treaty with a border, a defined border in Area C, right? So for those who are familiar with Oslo, let me step back and do a little, right? So Oslo divided what we call the West Bank into three regions, A, B, and C. So A is under full Palestinian control, Palestinian Authority control. B is under more or less full Palestinian control with some services still provided by the state of Israel. C, all the security services and municipal services are provided by Israel. And C is disputed, right? In the case, because in 1994, Area C, Israel was saying, this should be ours. And the Palestinians were saying, no, it should be ours. And so what did we do in Oslo? We agreed to talk about it later. And somehow later has never come, right? So if you are an Israeli maximalist, the minute you get a border, I'm certainly never building any more settlements or settling Jews on the other side of that border. But as long as you've got this ambiguous Area C, I can keep building there, right? I'll extend my, so on both sides, you don't have an incentive to change the status quo. It works for both sides right now to get what they want. That's why I say we have bad incentives right now. We're not incentivizing the Israelis or the Palestinians properly. Both sides are being incentivized to keep the status quo, and the status quo isn't really benefiting the actual people on the ground. So that is my concern and my view of where I see where we are with the incentives. And I think that a policy that is going to advance peace on both sides, it's very tempting. I mean, I am unashamedly, unabashedly pro-Israel and Zionist. So it's very easy for me to point the finger at everything that the Palestinians are doing to obstruct the peace process. And I feel like I have a lot of facts on that. But in the end, both sides have to get looked at, and you have to have good incentives on both sides to get to a peace. The other thing you have to have for a peace is do you have an overlapping end state that both sides can live with? Because there's a concern, again, I think right now the majority, but not a decisive majority, of Israelis would live next to an Arab state, a Palestinian Arab state, as long as they had a reasonable level of security guarantee. But there is some percentage of the Israeli population that is not interested in having an Israeli state or a Palestinian state. On the Palestinian side, there's unfortunately, far larger percentage of the population that is not interested in being at peace with a Jewish state. Right. So you also have to get to a point where the preponderance of opinion and influence on both sides is willing to live with the other side existing in some defined borders under some defined scheme. And I'm not sure we're there yet, but I think I'm optimistic that it could happen. So, yes, sir.
What's the third side?
Palestinian Authority, Hamas, Israelis. Right. Those are my three sides. Right. So, yes, ma'am.
You had mentioned that there were criteria that indicated that the UAE was interested in peace, and I'm wondering what those criteria were that tipped off the administration.
Well, I mean, it was nothing particularly cryptic, right? So, for example, when President Trump released his Deal of the Century plan, the ambassadors from the UAE and Bahrain to the United States came and sat in the audience while he talked. Now, they didn't endorse it; they weren't part of it, but they came and listened at the Secretary Pompeo's ministerial. I mean, a lot of countries, the Palestinians didn't come and participate, but there were countries, Arab countries, that did. The Emiratis were one of them. They showed up, they listened politely. So those kind of gestures were, kind of your obvious public steps that, okay, and there were things in private too that I don't want to get into, but from a public standpoint, there were public appearances by senior Emirati officials that made it seem like, all right, maybe they're willing to do more. So that was, just to give you a couple of examples. So, yes, sir.
Sorry, can we make sure we're using the microphone so that people online? This question may evidence some ignorance on my part, but when you were talking about incentives against lasting peace, I thought you were going to be referring to the Abraham Accords. And in my mind, and again, this may be my ignorance, but the Abraham Accords really don't have a lot to do with the Palestinians. They really are a peace between, or at least agreements between Israel and Gulf states.
Right.
And yeah. So let me ask you this, with a more, I'm going to say, perhaps generally a more conservative Israeli government currently. Do you have concerns that actions by the Israeli government may jeopardize some of the Abraham Accords agreements?
Remains to be seen. So I'll take that in two parts. So I'll answer your first part first. The effect that the Abraham Accords potentially could have with the Palestinians was that historically it was viewed that peace with broader regional partners wouldn't be possible until you got to a two-state solution. And what the Abraham Accords did was show, no, you could have a meaningful, not just peace of, we're going to have a piece of paper that says peace, but peace where you have significant cultural, economic, security cooperation across a wide array of, what two countries do when they're actually friends, they cooperate with each other. And you're seeing that now with Israel and Morocco, and you're seeing that now with Israel and the Emiratis, to a lesser extent, simply because they're a smaller country with Israel and Bahrain. I mean, Bahrain is a much tinier country than the Emirates or Morocco, but diplomatically influential in the region. So that also produced a set of incentives for the Palestinians. They don't have a veto anymore, so they don't get to control what the diplomatic decisions the other Arab countries make. So that was the first part. As far as the current Israeli government, if you've ever read the humorous books by Douglas Adams, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I don't know if anyone here is familiar with them. They're great, fun read, right? What does it say on the cover of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? It's 2 words: don't panic. And that would be my take right now for the current Israeli government. I think a lot of people are correctly concerned that members of the religious Zionism party are further outside the Israeli mainstream than we've seen other government members before. But Likud still has a pretty firm grip on the policy, and I think we understand where a Likud policy is because they've been they've been in government before in the last 2 decades a lot, and I don't think that they're fundamentally going to change their spots. I take Prime Minister Netanyahu at his word that right now his major foreign policy objective is the prevention of Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, and I don't think he's looking to do things that are going to change the status quo one way or another, either with Arab countries that are involved in the Abraham Accords or with the Palestinians. And on the more recent example of Minister Ben-Gvir's trip to the Temple Mount, in one sense I can understand why that was an annoyance for many people, but his actual act, what he actually did, was no different than previous Israeli government officials have been doing for the last couple of decades. It really wasn't a change in policy. And I think that what I would urge both our government and just people who are interested in Israel in general is, it is certainly possible that the ministers from religious Zionism will do things that will give reason for legitimate criticism. It would be best to wait until they actually do that. Let's not pre-criticize when they do something that's normal and interpret it to be outside normal. If they do something say or do something that is truly different, then I think both the administration here, other nations, governments, and the broader public can express their dissatisfaction then. But I have a lot of confidence that Likud's going to stay in the driver's seat. If you look at who's in the security cabinet with Netanyahu, that's not a different policy regime than what you had in previous Netanyahu governments from a philosophical. Now I'm mind blanking on his name. The new defense minister. He's Likud. He's not Benny Gantz, who's blue and white. But as far as the policy of running the defense ministry in Israel, I don't think you're going to get a lot of difference between the guy who his name is right at the tip of my tongue and I can't remember, which is embarrassing me, and Minister Gantz. You're not going to see a big policy difference, right? I mean, Blue and White's policy was basically the Likud policy, except they don't like Netanyahu, right? It's a group of Knesset ministers who, on a policy standpoint, would be perfectly happy with everything Likud does, except voting for Netanyahu as the party leader. And so, as far as the running of the defense ministry, as far as Minister Cohen running the foreign ministry, I don't see that being very different than what we've seen, in previous governments. So, my personal take. Yes, sir.
How did it work out? Is it just a coincidence that you and Avi and Jared Kushner were all-American Jews? Mm-hmm. That's one question.
Right.
And I think you sort of answered this a minute ago, but has the peace so far between Israel and the other Abrahamics warmer than that with Egypt? And were there other governments, and are there still other governments that want to negotiate something like this?
So, 3 good questions. If I'll start by answering the first, which I think was about me, Avi, and Jared, right? So there was me, Avi, and Jared. Second question was the warmer peace. There was a third in there too, right? Other countries, right? So I'll start with. I may go back. I might forget that as I answer, but let me start with me. I'm going to advance this. Or could you, which way? I want to go back one. Let's see, is this, no, that didn't do it. B, there we go. All right, so next to Jared is Rob Greenway there. Retired colonel, former Army Green Beret, BMI grad, deeply religious Christian man. Deeply religious Christian man. And I'm not here to do apologetics. If you want me to invite me back, I can do Jewish Christian apologetics, which is a different discussion. So he has a faith that I do not share, but I do respect. Right. And what was amazing about Rob was his ability to be trusted by both Israeli Jews and Arab Muslims as an American Christian man, and yet to maintain a trust and a closeness both ways. So was it a coincidence? Yeah, I mean, I wasn't hired into my job because of anything having to do with me being Jewish. As I said, I was there because of my relationship with Ambassador O'Brien, which is a personal friendship, and he's a Mormon. So, it had nothing to do with my religion. Avi and Jared knew each other through Orthodox circles in New York, but Jared was there because his father-in-law got elected president of the United States. So, it was interesting, and it was something that Avi and I reflected on occasionally in private about, that we thought as it was looking more and more possible that we could do this, that this would be something that would have an effect on Jewish history, right? I mean, it would have an effect on the Jewish state and Jewish history. We were certainly aware of that, but in the end, we were just kind of doing our job. And there was that I could tell, there was no forethought or plan. That's just how it worked. And in fact, Avi was a little surprised to find out that I was Jewish, because when he first met me, I was just the guy who knew how the Pentagon worked, right? I wasn't the Jewish guy who knew how the Pentagon worked. I was just Ambassador O'Brien's guy there at the National Security Council staff who knew how the Pentagon did business, and I knew who to go call to get these weapon systems delivered to Abu Dhabi faster rather than slower. That was so there's that. So your second question was warm peace versus cold peace. That I attribute in great manner to Jared Kushner, right? And the fact that he wasn't some government bureaucrat. I remember after we had the call, Greenway and I were in Jared's office in the White House, and we're going through all the, we got to get this MOU signed, we got to get the embassies, 2 embassies agreements to get embassies stood up, and then I was talking about, okay, we're gonna change what's called the UCP. We'll move Israel out of EUCOM and into CENTCOM now that the enough of the CENTCOM Arab nations now recognize Israel. We can afford to have Israeli officers in Tampa rather than having them in Brussels. And so I'm doing all of this, and Jared looks at me like I'm an idiot, which I was, right? He's like, when are we getting the businessmen, right? When are we getting, there was actually at one point I was laughing because I had a particularly contentious meeting after this with that Emirati Air Force officer. Remember, a guy wouldn't take yes for an answer, and he was making sure that his country's interests were being well represented, and we were talking about security cooperation, and I looked at my cell phone, and there was coverage, and Jared was in Abu Dhabi with taking pictures with an Israeli supermodel and an Emirati supermodel, and they had their national flags, the two women, they were taking pictures together, and all that. It's like, I want to be with the supermodels. I don't want to be with this Air Force. I got the short end of the stick here, right? So, but Jared was, he was less interested in the government to government and more interested in the people to people. It's like, for this to work, we have to have businesses doing business in each other's country. We have to have cultural exchanges. We have to have musicians playing music in each other's country. And that came from a guy who's married to a former supermodel who comes out of New York business, and he wasn't thinking about government. He was thinking about everything that wasn't government. And Greenway and I, who spent our entire career in government, we were thinking about government. And it made me also think that sometimes it's good to have some people in government who have done things with their life other than government. So I attribute a lot. But yes, warm peace, and we've seen that with the Emiratis and their investment in Israel. We see that in Morocco. I just came back, like I was talking before, I just came back from a vacation in Morocco, and I saw Israeli tourists in Marrakesh in a synagogue. I saw hotels that had fallen into disrepair, that had been previously owned by Jews who had fled, where their grandchildren are now coming back, Israelis of Moroccan descent, and they're investing money, and they're putting the hotels back together, and they're trying to revitalize areas of the Jewish quarter in Fez to really bring it back to life. So those are all fruits of the Abraham Accord. As far as other countries, everybody wants Saudi Arabia. I firmly believe had the election in 2020 gone differently, there were other countries we were talking to right up in December of 2020. There were other countries. If we had had a few more months or another 4 years, we could have gotten, I believe, I'll never know, but we could have gotten some additional Arab countries to sign. I hope the Biden administration achieves that. I think they would like to. There's certainly press reports that they're interested in getting Saudi Arabia to have some form of normalization with Israel. Israel is certainly interested in that. I think the current leadership in Saudi Arabia has shown some willingness. I think that Oman is another country where the Sultan there has shown a willingness to not be hostile. I think the Kuwaitis and the Qataris are further away. I think, then you have 3 major Arab countries right now that don't really have governments to speak of: Syria, Yemen, and Libya. There's not a functioning government in any of those countries to actually establish a relationship with. So, that time will tell on those. But for, Oman, Saudi, they would be the logical next 2 where you have functioning governments and governments that have shown willingness to at least, accept the presence and existence of Israel in some form to be negotiated. But they're a long way from Khartoum and the 3 no's of 67. I mean, we're a long way away from that with a lot of the Arabs. So hopefully that's the answer to your question. Yes, anything else? Sir, yes. Yeah, you want the microphone so they can hear us online.
Thank you.
Sure.
This is absolutely wonderful and very perceptive, and I think you're wrong to think your role was clearly just from the intelligence of the presentation and what we've all learned.
I was happy to be part of it in the room.
You mentioned that one of the key issues concerns the Emirates military were concerned about the reaction of Iran, and I wonder if you would talk about that going forward. The fear of many of the other Arab powers in the region of Iran seems to be a major, seems to have been likely, actually both, I guess, a major positive, and it sounded like maybe a little bit of a negative in driving Arab countries to associate with Israel,
So
which is the other superpower
Right.
in the region.
So there is certainly, I think it's certainly without question that Israel offers military capabilities to its allies in the region that counterbalance Iran. And I'm very interested in following closely what's happening with the protests in Iran. There is no reason that the Iranians have to be a malevolent influence in the region. Certainly not for their population. It's an educated, potentially prosperous country. They don't really have any historical territorial demands on that. I mean, you know, a lot of times you'll get tension. Like right now, you have tension between Morocco and Algeria because there's a big chunk of land that is currently controlled by Morocco that the Algerians said, hey, that's ours. And there's a good chunk of land historically that the Algerians are controlling that the Moroccans say, wait a minute, that's ours. And because of that, you know, you got battalions of tanks on either side of that line looking at each other. Hopefully they don't, you know, roll across the border on that. But that's, territorial demands will tend to create conflict. Then you get ideological differences that create conflict. Right now, you know, there's no reason that Iran should be in conflict with all of its neighbors. That's just what you get with the Ayatollahs. And you really can't underestimate the degree to which Iran, and right now, is being basically run by an organized crime family, which is what the IRGC is. And the it is unquestionable that the threat of Iran changed the Arab countries' behavior. So, and that they responded to that. So, as far as our ability to do security cooperation, that raises, you know, another little interesting vignette. The United Arab Emirates was founded in the early 70s after Great Britain, who had maintained a relationship with what was called the Trucial States, which were a series of small, little independent emirates in and around the Persian Gulf. And they really, you know, Britain basically was a light colonial power. They said, we'll take care of all of your foreign affairs, we'll provide defense, and we'll broker your oil deals for us. You run your own internal affairs, it'll be fine. And the Arabs in the region were actually fine with that until you get the east of Suez in the late 60s, right? Britain, their economy collapses, and they said, I'm pulling all of my military, anything that's east of Suez is coming back to the UK. And they look at the Trucial States and say, good luck to you guys. And they looked around, it's like, this isn't good. And really, two guys emerged. Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan of the Nahyan family, the Emir of Abu Dhabi, and Sheikh Rashid of the Maktoum family. And it's their two sons now who are the Emir of, you know, Sheikh Mohammed, who's the Emir of Abu Dhabi and the president of the country, and the Emir of Dubai, vice president of the country, is Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid, Sheikh Rashid's son. That are, I mean, so there are 7 emirates in the United Arab Emirates. Each emirate leader is part of the federal council, but it's not like the U.S. Senate. They don't like have a public debate about things, then vote 5-2 on what to do. They go into private, and then at the end, Sheikh Zayed, or Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, Sheikh Mohammed, the current president, comes out and tells everyone what they decided. And I can tell you, that was interesting because that was, as close as we were, that process was occasionally very opaque to us. But it was, you know, it functioned the way the Emiratis wanted it to function. I can tell you that, you know, those two families, because Abu Dhabi and Dubai are the two of the 7 emirates with the greatest population and frankly with the greatest wealth and natural resources, that they tend to set the pace in the other Emirates in the United Arab Emirates kind of conform to what they want. But so Sheikh Zayed, he didn't let any of his sons lay around the palace, you know, loafing off. So he told young Sheikh Mohammed as a young man, you have to go do something useful for this country. And Sheikh Mohammed joined the Air Force at the same time that we did our first F-16 deal with the Emirates back in the early 90s. So the current president of UAE is a former F-16 pilot. He spent 3-4 years going to flight school in Texas and is a Dallas Cowboys fan. No accounting for taste. That's just where the right. I am worried because if you know when we provide security cooperation, there's again back to the when I do it, it's security cooperation. When someone else does it, it's arms proliferation. It goes back to building those relationships, and it's not just I'm the guy or the U.S. is the guy who's showing up and putting the missile there or the fighter jet. It's all of the citizens of that country, and in some cases, it's the young fighter pilot that's going to be a CEO in 30 years, or it's going to be a cabinet minister in 30 years. If they see us, learn from us, learn to like us, right? It'll change the way they run their country. And I worry that sometimes we get a little too, we want to keep our hands a little too clean, a little too pure. You have a society that's not like ours, and we're reluctant to do security cooperation. And in many cases, that security cooperation, even with the transfer of arms, is also a great way to transfer values to certain key deciders in a society, especially societies that are not like ours. That's different than when we were trying to sell the F-35 to the Swiss, and they were trying to decide between the French plane and our plane. It's like the Swiss really aren't changing their values, right? They were just going to pick the airplane they liked the best for the best deal, right? But for some of these countries, whether it's a helicopter or a fighter jet or a missile or a boat or or a tank, it's a chance to change their values. So long answer to a short question.
Mark, we do have a question online.
Sure.
A PBS NewsHour report of January 3rd, 2023 states that a tiny number of Emiratis are traveling to Israel and public support for the Accords in UAE has dropped. Do you have a comment on that?
Didn't see the news report. The last time I was in the Emirates was a year ago from now, so I haven't been since last time I was in the Emirates was in the December of 2021, so just over a year ago. I was there at the World's Fair. Israel had a pavilion at the World's Fair in Dubai, and when I was there, it was pretty well attended by the local area. I mean, there was crowds, and they seemed happy and interested. So I hadn't seen that report. I don't have any information to say I think it's accurate or not accurate. I think that what I saw, they seemed at least interested. I can tell you that the economic activity between the two countries continues to grow pretty well. But haven't seen the report about public opinion, so I don't know how to comment on it. So.
And I think we have time for one more question.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Getting back to the issue of the international crime syndicate that you were alluding to with Iran.
Yes.
What do you think the impact of the Russian-Ukrainian war might have on the region, particularly on Iran, and the potential fall of Putin?
So one of the things it's done is clarify, in people's mind what these actors are. Because we now see Iran is producing drones. They're sending those drones to Russia to be used in Ukraine. Russia is paying for that with petrodollars that is propping up Iran's economy right now. Many people have thought, well, what Russia did is illegal, so no one's going to start shipping them arms. And Iran has proven that wrong, right? First, there are plenty of people, Iran ships arms for naked aggression in Yemen and naked aggression in Gaza. Why wouldn't they ship arms for naked aggression in Ukraine? I have no idea what's going to happen to Putin's leadership. I can tell you, when I was on the National Security Council staff, we had one counterpart meeting with our Russian counterparts. Sergei Petrushev is Putin's national security advisor, and I would just say, based on my experience, I would not trust anything he has to say. So they are thoroughly unscrupulous. Interesting, my counterpart at the time, I don't know if he's still there, was actually also a former naval officer. He was a retired Russian flag officer named Mikhail Popov, and he's one of the biggest human beings I've ever met. And I'm not used to being around people who are much bigger than me, but this guy was like 6'7", but he was also wider, and he was bigger than me in every dimension. I mean, I'm unfortunately wider than I should be, but just a literal bear of a man. If you picture the Russian bear, that would be Admiral Popov. Yeah, and we had one counterpart meeting where we tried to get the Russians to some meaningful progress on some issues. This was back in 2020, and it was not a pleasant experience. The only thing I could say is I managed to find a really good pizza parlor in Geneva, Switzerland, where we had the counterpart, and that was the only highlight of the trip. The actual discussion with the Russians was less than fruitful, so I'm not optimistic. What happens to Putin and his leadership remains to be seen. I wouldn't make any guesses. So,
I'd like to thank Mark for being here
thank you. My
today.
pleasure.
And thank you all for being here. And we have refreshments outside in the gathering space, so enjoy.